Now we're going to talk about how your preaching can have a massive impact on your community. I don't know if you realize this or not, but did you know that your preaching can have a massive impact on people who aren't even in the room? That your preaching can literally change the lives of people who've never walked into the door. Well, I'm going to give you a couple of principles to explain how this can happen, and then some techniques so you can make sure this does start happening. So we're going to be building on what we've learned about preaching for growth, but now we're going to be adding another layer on top of that. See, there's a couple principles I think it's important to understand. First is, what you hear, you forget. What you write down, you remember. But what you teach, you know. I'll give you an example. When I was in 10th grade, I was not a very good student. I didn't really pay attention in class. I didn't really study. And I really struggled specifically with my math class. And my final grade in Math 10 was a D minus. I got 53%. I passed by the skin of my teeth, and probably a little bit of grace from my teacher. Well, while I was dumb, I was no dummy. And I knew I didn't have a hope in hell in ever passing grade 11 math. So I took Math 11 for dummies. Remedial math, that was going to be a lot easier. And it was a good move because in remedial math for dummies, I got 60%. Well, then I took grade 12 math for dummies and I got 70%. I must have had a really good teacher. However, I realized you don't get to go to university with math for dummies. Part of the entrance requirements is that you passed real math. And so that second semester of grade 12, I took real math. Now, it turns out that I changed schools in the middle of grade 12. Went to a different province, and I was at this boarding school. And it just so happened that the first unit that we were taking in real math 12 was the same as the last unit I just took the week before in math 12 for dummies. So I kind of, at least at a 70% level, knew the subject matter. And as it turns out, there was a really cute girl whose desk was right beside me. Her name was Heather, who didn't really understand what was going on. Was I the kind of guy who's going to let Heather down? Nope. So because I had my 70% understanding, I could help Heather out a little bit and kind of explain things to her. And if the way I explained it to her didn't make sense, well, can I think of another way of explaining? Maybe I could explain it like this way. Well, while I was explaining things to Heather, the guy behind me, Dale, he didn't understand either. And he asked me some questions. And so I tried explaining things to Dale the exact same way I explained it to Heather, but sometimes that didn't work. And so I had to think of, another way of explaining it so Dale could understand. Well, on that first test, I saw a grade that I'd never seen in my life. I got like 99%. The only reason I didn't get 100% is because I added 2 and 3 and got 6. And I was thinking like, oh, if I'd only used my fingers when I counted, I would have got 100. Well, the next unit was brand new material. But was I going to let Heather down? No, I was doing my best to pay attention so I could explain things to Heather. And if she didn't understand it, I'd find another way of explaining it. And then I would explain things to Dale. And this continued through the rest of the class. And by the end of the class, now I'm having debates with my teacher about different mathematical concepts, about how we should be calculating tangent lines when they're intersecting with a parabolic curve, and how it should only be intersecting the curve at one point because he said it was 2 points. And we're like, hey, that doesn't even make sense in Euclidean space. That's logically impossible because between any two points, there's always an infinite number. Anyways. My final grade in real math 12 was 98%. What's my point? My point is this. What you hear, you forget. What you write down, you remember. But what you teach, you know. Okay, we're going to take that principle. I want to put a pin on it right now. We're going to come back to that because it has a lot to do with our preaching. The second concept that I want to introduce you to is to imagine for a moment, what would it take for you to start regularly attending a mosque? Well, you might say, well, that'd be a 0% chance that I would ever go to a mosque. I said, well, why? I said, well, because I'm a Christian. Okay, well, hypothetically, let's just say something happened and you lost your faith. You going to be going to a mosque next Friday? Yeah, even if I lost my faith, yeah, I ain't going to no mosque. Well, what if you were going through job loss or death or divorce and like things in your life were really hitting the fan and you were desperate? Yeah, even if I was desperate, I ain't going to no mosque. Well, let's say that the mosque down the street was a cool mosque, where they dressed fairly casually and had, modern music, maybe even smoke, lights, and lasers. Yeah, even if it was cool mosque, I still wouldn't be going to no mosque, John. Well, what if you had a buddy at work, Ali, who seemed to be a decent guy? Would then you go to a mosque? Yeah, John, I ain't going to no mosque. Okay, well, let's just say over the last couple years, Ali had been sharing little nuggets of truth from the Quran that's really made sense to you and is actually making a positive impact on your life. Well, all of a sudden, that's not crazy. Well, here's the thing. That's never going to happen because that stuff isn't in the Quran, but it is in the Bible. The point is, you can actually disciple people without them even knowing that's what you're doing. Like even when we look in our Gospels, you will see that Jesus started discipling the disciples years before they became Christians. We can, with our family members, with our friends, with our neighbors, with our coworkers, we can be sharing little bits of truth, little bits of advice, little bits of wisdom. We can be speaking to those people's lives without them having a clue that what we're doing is we are preemptively discipling them. Well, imagine for a second that you began equipping your people to start discipling their family, to start discipling their friends, their neighbors, and their coworkers. What would happen? Well, let's marry those two concepts now. What you hear, you forget. What you write down, you remember. What you teach, you know. If your own people are now taking what you're saying and going out and teaching others, every nugget of truth they got for you on Sunday, now they're going out to transform their workplace, to transform their neighborhood, to transform their family. What do you think is going to happen in their own hearts? Well, what you hear, you forget. What you write down, you remember. What you teach, you know. Now that they're teaching, the impact your preaching had on the lives of your own people is going to be amplified tenfold, because they're not only putting it to practice for their lives, they're actually teaching it and explaining it to others. The things you've taught them are going to be built in and ingrained deep, deep within their hearts. Why did we focus on preaching for growth before we started talking about preaching for impact? Well, as I'd mentioned last session, when you preach in gobbledygook, people learn in gobbledygook. But when you preach in plain English that everybody can understand, your people learn in plain English that they can share with anybody. What you've taught from the stage now makes sense in the workplace. So when we teach in plain English, our people learn in plain English and they can share it in plain English. Well, how do we implement this? How do we put this into practice? Well, let's go back to our basic sermon structure. So our basic sermon outline was, we're going to discern the problem to solve or the next step to take. 2, discover what God says about that. 3, preach what God says. That finds itself in the basic sermon structure of we're going to start with a hook, which is defining the problem. We're going to move to the meat. What is God's solution to the problem? And then we're going to land the plane on the application. How do we actually put this in practice? So what we're going to do is we're going to tweak this. We're going to keep those same 3 elements, but now we're going to still including the newcomer. But now with the hook, we're going to define the problem in a way that includes people we know in the community. So for example, you might say, well, maybe you've struggled with this, or maybe you know someone at work who struggles with this. So right in the hook, even the person in the pew might say, well, you know what, this doesn't apply to me personally. But because you said, or maybe you know someone that it does, they're thinking, yeah, you know what? But I know Linda at work, she's going through this right now. Okay, so right in the hook, you're explaining it in a way, not just for them, but hey, or maybe you know somebody who's struggling with this. Get them thinking right at the beginning about personal application and how this applies to people they know. 2, when we get to the meat, God's solution to the problem and how can this affect others. It's not just how God's solution can affect you, it's how God's selection can affect you and the people you know. And then lastly, for the application, how do we actually put this into practice? Well, we're not just going to end things on a personal takeaway. Now, I think it's pastors who end a sermon on a clear-cut, one-sentence takeaway. That's a strong way to end a sermon. But even better than leaving things on a strong takeaway is to leave things on a strong shareable. Leave things in a way that the application point makes sense to them, but it's something that they could post on Instagram. It's something that they could share at the water cooler. Give them a little bit of nugget, not only that applies to them, but a little bit of nugget that I can take to work tomorrow. End your application point with a shareable. Now, when you build your sermon with the intent of having your people share what they've learned, several things are going to happen. 1, your people are going to remember, learn, and apply things 10 times better because now they're sharing and they're teaching what they've learned. You are now really, really going to be much more effective at seeing transformation through your preaching in the lives of your own people. 2, your people are now equipped to be a mobilized force of salt and light in your community, like you're intentionally equipping them and sending them out. Your preaching isn't just transforming the lives of people inside your building, but outside as well. And then number 3, with your people going outside and discipling their friends, their neighbors, their coworkers, you know that 4% of the people in the room we talked about? Well, that 4% now that your people are mobilized can easily grow to 8% or more. And instead of seeing double your average attendance in a year, you can see quadruple your average attendance in a year. This is what unlocks the potential for true revival and community transformation.